This is the Champion of Democracy Element 2 Part 1 about World War I on the home front and how we ended up in this mess in the first place. Now, if you remember, various ships had been sunk by German U-boats, some carrying munitions, some not, and the Germans had promised that they were only going to sink those boats that they knew were carrying munitions after they had let passengers off to have safe passage. Well, in January 1917, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare. This was risking war with the United States, but the Germans had to do it. At this point, it was a war of attrition, meaning you're not really trying to deliver the knockout blow and win, you're just trying to survive and outlast the other guy. And Germany, at this point, was on their last legs. They needed to starve the Allies out, so they needed to make sure Britain bowed out before they did. Now, Germany wasn't concerned about American military might. We just weren't that strong of an army at that point. But the U.S. would be a fresh fighter jumping into the last round of the fight while the Germans would be broken down. So it was pretty imperative that the Germans shut the British down before the U.S. could get involved. And if that meant sinking ships with Americans on them, so be it. Now, remember, Wilson had agreed to give munitions to the Allies, and also remember that Wilson was an isolationist, but he was being backed into a corner. With the selling of munitions to the Allies, the U.S. economy was thriving without having to be in a war. And Wilson wanted to keep it that way, but it wasn't going to be easy. If the Germans were sinking all boats bound for Great Britain and France, Americans were going to die. And if Americans were going to die, Wilson was going to have to really strongly consider breaking away from his isolationist stance. And that decision got a whole lot easier in March of 1917 when the Zimmermann Note was intercepted by the British and given to the United States. Now, the Zimmermann Note had been written in code, but you can see the decoded version here on the slide in front of you. If you take a second to pause the video and read this through, you're going to find out that Germany had sent a wire to Mexico asking them to invade the United States. The idea was that the Mexicans would keep the United States occupied in a war of their own here in the Americas, while the Germans continued to sink ships bound for Britain. If Mexico could keep the United States occupied, that would allow Germany time to starve out Great Britain and France and win the war, thus also keeping the United States and their fresh legs out of it. And what would be Mexico's reward? Well, it was the flimsy promise of getting Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico back if Germany eventually won the war. Remember, these territories were lost by Mexico to the United States in the 1840s. Also in March, 4 more unarmed American merchant ships were sunk. Between the Zimmermann Note and the sinking of American merchant ships, the U.S. media began noting that the only difference between war and what we have now is that we aren't fighting back. And so, in April of 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany. Wilson was reluctant, as were 6 senators and 50 House reps. America, especially in the landlocked Midwest, was a bit lukewarm about entering a war to stop the submarine. So, Wilson tried another approach to motivate the United States. He claimed that we were the only ones who could make the world safe for democracy. And with that, the champion of democracy was born. America began to feel that our cause was virtuous, not selfish. The other allies were fighting for riches and territorial gain, but not us. Wilson had turned World War I into a crusade for democracy in the world, and it worked. America was now fired up to a fever pitch, and Wilson had found a cause for him to believe in as well. To many, Wilson is now viewed as the moral leader of the Allies, and in January 1918, he presents his 14-point peace plan. Now, the war's not over yet, but he's putting this plan in place so that it's there when the war gets done. Now, if you take a look at the first 5 points here, there are really no surprises. They're pretty broad. There are no secret treaties, no blockades or attacking ships, no economic barriers, limiting arms, adjusting colonial claims in the best interest of both the colonizers and the natives. It basically had appeal to all nations, although governments on both sides weren't exactly thrilled about the fifth point, which said that you had to reduce the military forces and/or weapons. It also called for self-determination of ethnic groups that were currently living within the borders of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Again, some people in Europe weren't really all that thrilled when it was done because Germany and Austria-Hungary, which looked like this in 1914, would turn into this by 1918. A lot of different countries based on the ethnic groups that had lived in the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. Now, this is what Wilson wanted. He wanted those ethnic groups to set up their own governments and their own borders. In other words, have self-determination about what was going to happen next. But the other allies weren't overly thrilled about Wilson's plan because they had hoped that when the war was over, they'd basically carve up Germany and Austria-Hungary to have colonies for themselves. Well, Wilson didn't want that. However, while all these other things were part of the 14-point peace plan, the most famous of the 14 points was, well, the 14th point, a League of Nations that would provide a system of collective security. In other words, if we were all allied together, none of us would dare to rise up against the rest of the world. If one did rise up, the rest of us would just gang up on that country. Wilson was attempting to do the impossible, reach world peace. He wanted to be the president that ended war in the world. Now, a lot of people applauded this effort. Congress called it the 14 Commandments of Wilson Almighty, so it had its critics as well. Now, how is this going to turn out? Well, stay tuned for part 2 of Element 2 coming up in the next tutorial. Thanks for listening.